The moment my father reached past my wife and claimed her seat, as if her comfort no longer mattered, I realized I had spent 36 years mistaking obedience for respect. Emily was 9 months pregnant, and every step she took that afternoon was careful and measured. Our daughter Olivia stayed close beside her, proudly carrying a tiny gift bag she had picked out for her grandmother. It was supposed to be a simple family lunch at my parents' favorite restaurant, one last gathering before our son arrived. Emily had smiled all morning despite the weight she carried, joking that she hoped the baby would wait until after dessert. I believed we were walking into another ordinary family tradition. I had no idea everything was about to change. The hostess welcomed us inside and led us toward a large table by the windows. Emily eased herself into the chair nearest the aisle with visible relief, placing one hand beneath her stomach as she slowly caught her breath. She had been on her feet longer than usual, and even our obstetrician had reminded us to avoid unnecessary strain during these final days. Olivia climbed into the seat beside her mother, happily arranging crayons the waitress had brought over. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. Then my parents arrived. My mother glanced around the table before quietly saying she preferred Emily's chair because it was easier to get in and out. Before Emily could even respond, my father stepped forward, placed both hands on the back of her chair, and firmly motioned for her to stand so my mother could sit there instead. Emily looked surprised but remained calm. She slowly rose to her feet without saying a single harsh word. My father acted as though nothing unusual had happened. My mother accepted the seat without hesitation. The conversation around the table continued almost immediately. Forks clinked against plates, menus opened, and someone laughed about the weather outside. It was as if the only person who mattered least at that table was the woman carrying my child. Emily stood quietly for several seconds until the hostess hurried over with another chair from a nearby table. She thanked the young woman with the same gentle smile she offered everyone, even though I could see the disappointment she was trying so hard to hide. Olivia leaned toward me and whispered, "Daddy, why did Mommy have to move?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. My silence tasted heavier than anything I had ever swallowed. Looking across the table, I saw my father chatting comfortably with the waiter, already discussing today's specials. My mother complimented the restaurant's new decorations. No one acknowledged what had just happened. No one apologized. Emily quietly adjusted herself into the replacement chair and rested both hands across her stomach, taking a slow breath before smiling at Olivia and asking about the picture she was coloring. Watching her choose kindness instead of confrontation should have made me proud. Instead, it filled me with shame. Because deep inside, I recognized something I had spent years refusing to admit. This wasn't the first time my father had expected everyone else to rearrange themselves around my mother. It was simply the first time the cost had become impossible for me to ignore. As the waiter poured glasses of iced tea and everyone settled into casual conversation, I found myself staring at the reflection in the restaurant window instead of listening to their voices. The man looking back at me wasn't the husband I believed I had become. He was still the little boy who had learned that keeping the peace mattered more than protecting the people he loved. And sitting beside me was the woman who deserved far better than the silence I had given her. Lunch continued as though nothing unusual had happened, and somehow that made everything feel even stranger. The waiter returned with baskets of warm bread, glasses of iced tea, and cheerful conversation that floated around the table without ever touching the silence inside me. My father asked about a baseball game he had watched the night before. My mother complimented the restaurant's chicken pot pie. My aunt laughed at a story about her neighbor's new puppy. Emily smiled politely whenever someone spoke to her, answering every question with the same warmth she always carried, yet I noticed she shifted carefully every few minutes, searching for a comfortable position in the replacement chair. I had watched her spend the last several weeks sleeping only a few hours at a time because our son had grown so much that even resting had become difficult. She never complained. She simply adapted. That was who she was. Olivia colored quietly beside her mother, occasionally looking back and forth between us with the kind of curiosity only children possess. She was too young to understand family dynamics, but she was old enough to recognize when something felt unfair. She leaned against Emily and gently placed her small hand on her mother's arm. Emily smiled down at her, kissed the top of her head, and continued listening to everyone else as though nothing had happened. That simple act of grace somehow hurt me more than an argument ever could have. I remembered another family dinner almost 5 years earlier, shortly after Emily and I announced our first pregnancy. My father had insisted that everyone postpone leaving because my mother wanted dessert served exactly the way she preferred it. Emily had been exhausted then too, but she stayed without complaint because I quietly asked her to be patient. I told myself it was only one evening. A year later, when Olivia celebrated her third birthday, my mother decided the decorations Emily had chosen were too childish. My father agreed immediately, and within minutes everyone was rearranging the room, while Emily stood there pretending it did not bother her. Again I stayed silent because I convinced myself it was easier than creating tension. There had always been another explanation, another excuse, another reason to keep the peace. Looking back across those years, I realized that every compromise had been made by the same person. Emily adjusted. Emily apologized. Emily smiled. Emily sacrificed. Somewhere along the way, I had mistaken her kindness for endless strength. I had assumed she could carry every uncomfortable moment because she never complained about carrying them. The truth was much harder to face. She should never have been carrying them alone. The meals eventually arrived, filling the table with the smell of grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes, and fresh herbs. Emily barely touched her food. She quietly admitted she felt full after only a few bites, which was completely normal this late in pregnancy. Instead of asking whether she needed anything, my father casually joked that pregnancy had made young people overly sensitive these days. A few relatives chuckled politely before returning to their meals. I watched Emily lower her eyes toward her plate, choosing silence once again. At that exact moment, I understood something I should have recognized years before. Keeping the peace had never actually created peace. It had simply transferred every uncomfortable burden from my parents onto my wife. The bill had not been paid with money. It had been paid one quiet moment at a time, one swallowed disappointment after another, until the woman I loved had learned to expect less from the family she had worked so hard to embrace. As I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over hers, she looked up with a tired but genuine smile. She squeezed my fingers softly, almost as if she believed I needed reassurance more than she did. She had no idea that something inside me had finally begun to change, and for the first time since we walked into that restaurant, I realized the hardest conversation of my life was no longer a matter of if. It had become a matter of when. We finished lunch almost an hour later, but the heaviness followed us into the parking lot like an unexpected storm cloud. The late afternoon sun reflected across rows of parked cars, and a warm breeze carried the scent of fresh pavement after a brief summer shower. Emily walked slowly beside me with one hand supporting her lower back, while Olivia skipped ahead toward our SUV, humming a song she had learned at school. Before I could unlock the doors, Emily stopped and closed her eyes for a moment. She rested both hands beneath her stomach and took a slow, careful breath. My heart tightened immediately. I asked if everything was all right, and she answered with the same reassuring smile she always gave me. She said the baby had become especially active during lunch and that she probably just needed to sit down for a few minutes. Even so, I noticed something different in her face. She looked more tired than she had that morning. Once everyone climbed into the vehicle, I adjusted the air conditioning and handed her a bottle of water from the cooler we always kept in the back seat. Olivia buckled herself in and happily chatted about the picture she had colored at the restaurant. Then she suddenly became quiet. Looking at us through the rearview mirror, she asked in the softest voice, "Daddy, is Mommy in trouble because Grandma wanted that chair?" The innocence of her question pierced straight through me. Emily immediately turned toward Olivia and gently explained that nobody was in trouble and that sometimes grown-ups made choices they should think more carefully about. She never criticized my parents. She never spoke with bitterness. Even after everything that had happened, she protected Olivia from carrying anger that did not belong to her. As we pulled onto the highway, I could not stop replaying the afternoon inside my head. Every detail returned with uncomfortable clarity. My father had never raised his voice. My mother had never demanded anything directly. There had been no dramatic argument for people to remember. Instead, there had been something much more familiar. Quiet entitlement. Automatic compliance. Decades of invisible rules that everyone seemed to follow without questioning them. For the first time in my life, I saw those rules exactly as they were. They had never been about kindness or respect. They had always been about making one person's comfort more important than everyone else's. 20 minutes into the drive, Emily placed her hand over mine, resting on the center console. She thanked me for taking her home instead of stopping by my parents' house for coffee like we usually did after family lunches. I admitted that I simply wanted her to rest. She smiled gently and said she appreciated that more than I realized. Then she hesitated before quietly adding something that completely caught me off guard. She told me she had spent years trying to earn my parents' approval because she loved me and wanted Olivia to grow up surrounded by family. She said every awkward holiday, every uncomfortable dinner, and every overlooked feeling had seemed worthwhile if it meant keeping the family together. But she also admitted that after today, she no longer believed anything she did would ever be enough. Those words settled over me with a weight I could not escape. She was not angry. She was simply tired. Tired of hoping. Tired of adjusting. Tired of believing the next gathering would somehow be different. By the time we reached home, the neighborhood was peaceful. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks while sprinklers watered freshly cut lawns. It looked like the kind of ordinary American evening that usually brought me comfort. Instead, I sat in the driveway with the engine turned off, realizing that the family I had spent my entire life trying to protect had quietly become the very place where my own wife no longer felt safe being herself. At that moment, my phone buzzed with a new message from my father. It contained only one short sentence. "Your mother enjoyed lunch today. We should do this again next weekend." I stared at the screen for several long seconds before locking the phone without replying. For the first time, silence no longer felt like keeping the peace. It felt like postponing the truth. The next morning began with the quiet rhythm we had built together over the years. Emily was already awake when I came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of herbal tea and a blanket draped across her lap. The sunrise painted soft shades of gold across the hardwood floor, and for a moment our home felt untouched by everything that had happened the day before. Olivia wandered into the kitchen a few minutes later wearing mismatched pajamas and carrying her favorite stuffed rabbit. Emily smiled, helped her pour a bowl of cereal, and asked about the picture she wanted to draw for the baby. Watching them together reminded me how naturally Emily created peace wherever she went. She never demanded attention. She simply made every room feel warmer. As I prepared breakfast, I noticed Emily pause again, closing her eyes while resting one hand against her stomach. She assured me the baby was moving normally, but I could hear a trace of fatigue beneath her calm voice. We had an appointment with Dr. Michael Harris scheduled for later that morning, one of the final routine checkups before the due date, so neither of us thought much of it. The drive to the medical office was unusually quiet. Emily looked out the passenger window while Olivia pointed excitedly at construction trucks along the road. Every few miles I glanced toward Emily, hoping she would tell me she felt completely fine. Instead, she simply smiled each time our eyes met, almost as though she wanted to spare me from worrying. Dr. Harris greeted us with his usual reassuring manner and carefully reviewed Emily's vital signs before beginning the examination. Everything appeared stable, but after asking a few additional questions about the previous afternoon, he encouraged Emily to take things as easy as possible over the next several days. He explained that late pregnancy placed significant demands on the body and that unnecessary physical strain or stressful situations were worth avoiding whenever possible. His words were calm and professional, yet each sentence echoed inside my mind. Stressful situations. Unnecessary strain. I knew exactly where both had come from. As we walked back through the hallway toward the parking lot, Emily slipped her hand into mine and quietly thanked me for coming with her. I stopped walking and looked at her for a long moment. Then I apologized, not only for the lunch the day before, but for every holiday, birthday, and family gathering where I had expected her patience to compensate for my silence. She looked surprised before gently shaking her head. She told me she had never wanted me to choose between my parents and his own family. She had only wanted me to recognize that she and our children were my family too. Those words settled deeper than any lecture ever could. During the drive home, my phone rang through the hands-free system. My father's name appeared across the dashboard display. I let it ring until the call ended. A few seconds later, another call came from my mother. I did not answer that one either. Then a text message appeared asking whether we wanted to come over for dinner because my mother had leftovers she did not want to waste. Reading those ordinary words after everything that had happened felt strangely unsettling. There was no mention of Emily, no acknowledgement that anything had been hurtful. It was simply another invitation to return to the same pattern that had existed for decades. When we arrived home, Olivia ran inside to draw another picture for her baby brother, while Emily settled into the living room with her feet elevated on a pillow. I sat alone on the back porch listening to the distant sound of lawn mowers and birds in the neighborhood trees. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what life would look like if I stopped protecting old habits instead of protecting the people I loved most. That question stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon, and before the sun disappeared below the rooftops, I finally understood that the next conversation with my parents could not sound anything like the ones we had shared before. The following afternoon, my phone rang while I was organizing the nursery closet. The caller identification showed Aunt Linda. She rarely called without a reason, so I stepped onto the back porch before answering. Her voice was warm but unusually hesitant. She asked how Emily was feeling and whether the doctor's appointment had gone well. After I assured her everything looked stable, she became quiet for several seconds. Finally, she said there was something she had wanted to tell me for years but never found the courage to say. She explained that what happened at the restaurant had disturbed her because it reminded her of countless moments she had witnessed throughout our family's history. She told me my father had always expected every gathering to revolve around my mother's preferences, no matter how small the issue seemed. Most people had learned to stay silent because challenging him usually led nowhere. I leaned against the porch railing as she described holidays I barely remembered. She recalled relatives changing dinner times, vacations, seating arrangements, and family traditions simply to avoid conflict. At the time, I had been too young to notice. As an adult, I had accepted those patterns because they felt normal. Aunt Linda gently reminded me that normal and healthy were not always the same thing. She also shared something that caught me completely by surprise. She said Emily had privately asked her for advice almost 2 years earlier. Emily had wondered if she was somehow failing to earn my parents' acceptance. Rather than blaming anyone, she had asked what she could do differently to make family gatherings more comfortable for everyone. Hearing those words filled me with a sadness I could barely describe. While I had been convincing myself that patience would eventually solve everything, Emily had been quietly searching for ways to fix a problem she had never created. Aunt Linda sighed softly before saying something I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. She told me that kindness without boundaries often becomes an invitation for people to expect even more. She was not criticizing my parents with anger. She sounded heartbroken that the cycle had continued into another generation. Before ending the call, she encouraged me to build the kind of home where my children would never question whether they belonged. After we hung up, I remained outside for a long time listening to the wind moving through the maple trees behind our fence. Every memory seemed to fit together differently now. I remembered Emily insisting that we host Thanksgiving ourselves one year because she wanted everyone to feel welcome. She had spent 2 full days preparing the meal, only to apologize when my mother casually suggested the mashed potatoes needed more butter. I remembered Christmas mornings when Emily quietly wrapped extra presents for my parents because she wanted them to feel appreciated. I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and countless thoughtful gestures that had never been returned with the same generosity. None of those memories had seemed important on their own. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. That evening, Emily found me sitting in the nursery, assembling the baby's rocking chair. She noticed my expression immediately and asked what was on my mind. I told her about my conversation with Aunt Linda. Emily listened without interrupting, then gently rested her hand over mine. She said she did not want revenge, an argument, or even an apology forced by guilt. She simply wanted our children to grow up believing that respect was something every member of a family deserved, not something they had to earn by staying quiet. Her words settled over the room with remarkable clarity. Looking around at the freshly painted walls, the neatly folded baby blankets, and the tiny crib waiting for our son, I realized we were preparing far more than a nursery. We were preparing the kind of home where old habits would finally stop following us from one generation to the next. The conversation I had been avoiding finally arrived 2 days later. Saturday morning was quiet, and Emily was resting in the living room while Olivia carefully arranged picture books beside the baby's bassinet. My phone rang just after 10 o'clock. It was my father again. This time I answered. He greeted me as though nothing unusual had happened during our last family lunch. He immediately began talking about a neighborhood barbecue he wanted everyone to attend the following weekend. He mentioned that my mother had already planned the menu and expected Emily to bring her homemade peach cobbler because everyone liked it better than the bakery version. I listened without interrupting until he finally paused to take a breath. Then I calmly said that we would not be attending. There was complete silence on the other end of the call. After several long seconds, he laughed softly, convinced I was joking. When I repeated that we would be staying home, his voice changed. He asked whether Emily had filled my head with unnecessary drama. Hearing my wife blamed so casually should have surprised me, but it did not. It simply confirmed everything I had finally begun to understand. I told him this decision had nothing to do with Emily encouraging me. It was my decision because I had watched the woman carrying my child be treated with less consideration than she deserved, and I had remained silent for too many years. My father immediately defended himself. He insisted everyone was making far too much out of a simple seating arrangement. He reminded me that families should not hold grudges over little misunderstandings. I answered as calmly as I could. I explained that the chair itself had never been the real issue. The problem was that Emily's comfort had been considered optional, while everyone else's expectations had been treated as unquestionable. He interrupted several times, insisting I was rewriting history. I refused to argue. Instead, I quietly said something I had rehearsed in my mind for days. I told him that from now on my first responsibility was protecting the family I had promised to build with Emily, and every decision I made would begin there. Another long silence followed before he asked whether I truly intended to choose my wife over my own parents. For most of my life, that question would have filled me with guilt. This time it filled me with clarity. I answered that I was not choosing one family over another. I was choosing respect over habit. I was choosing kindness over fear of disappointing people. Most importantly, I was choosing the example my children would remember when they grew up. He ended the conversation by saying he needed time to think before abruptly hanging up. I sat quietly with the phone still in my hand, surprised by how peaceful I felt. There had been no shouting, no insults, and no dramatic confrontation. There had only been honesty, perhaps for the first time in our relationship. Emily walked onto the porch a few minutes later, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. She sat beside me without asking what had happened because she had already guessed. I told her everything. She listened carefully, then squeezed my hand and smiled with the same quiet warmth that had carried our family through every difficult season. She did not celebrate. She did not criticize my parents. She simply thanked me for speaking with the same kindness I wanted our children to learn. Looking across our backyard, I watched Olivia carefully placing a tiny stuffed bear inside the baby's crib, making sure everything looked perfect before her little brother arrived. In that ordinary moment, I realized something extraordinary had already changed. The cycle that had quietly shaped generations of our family had finally met its first boundary. And for the first time since becoming a husband and a father, I truly believed our children would inherit something far more valuable than family traditions. They would inherit the certainty that love and respect always belong together. 3 days later, just before sunrise, Emily gently touched my shoulder and whispered that she thought her contractions had started. There was no panic in her voice, only quiet certainty. We had packed our hospital bags weeks earlier, so within minutes I was helping Olivia into the car while Emily walked slowly beside us. The streets were almost empty, the sky painted with soft shades of blue and orange as we drove toward the hospital. Every few minutes I glanced at Emily, who smiled each time she noticed me looking. She kept reminding me to focus on the road, joking that our son deserved to arrive with calm parents instead of nervous ones. By the time we reached the maternity entrance, the contractions had become more regular. The nurses welcomed us with reassuring smiles and quickly helped Emily settle into a comfortable room. Dr. Michael Harris examined her and confirmed that labor was progressing normally. Hearing those words released a breath I felt as though I had been holding for days. Olivia stayed with my sister until later that morning, and for the first time since the restaurant lunch, the noise inside my mind finally became quiet. My attention belonged entirely to Emily. Hours passed slowly. We talked about baby names one final time, laughed about Olivia insisting her little brother should learn to play baseball before he learned to walk, and wondered what color his eyes would be. Then, while Emily rested between contractions, My phone began vibrating across the small hospital table. My father was calling again. I let it ring. A minute later, another call appeared. Then another. Finally, a text message arrived. It read, "Your mother wants to come meet the baby as soon as he is born. Tell the nurses we are coming." I looked at the screen for several seconds before quietly locking my phone. Emily noticed the expression on my face and asked if everything was all right. I handed her the phone without saying a word. She read the message, then simply nodded before placing it back on the table. She did not ask me what I planned to do. She trusted me to decide. That trust carried more weight than any argument ever could. About an hour later, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I answered because I believed avoiding the conversation would only delay it. She sounded excited, already talking about holding her grandson and taking family photographs before we returned home. When she finally paused, I calmly explained that we were not receiving visitors that day. The room remained silent except for the steady rhythm of medical equipment nearby. She asked whether Emily had requested that decision. I answered honestly, no, we had made the decision together. I explained that we wanted our son's first hours to be peaceful and focused entirely on our little family. Then I added something I had never said before. I told her that rebuilding trust would take time, and until that happened we needed space. She sounded disappointed, but before she could continue, my father took the phone. His voice carried the same confidence I had heard throughout my childhood. He insisted grandparents had every right to meet a newborn immediately. I quietly replied that being grandparents was a privilege built on healthy relationships, not an automatic entitlement. There was another long silence. This time I did not rush to fill it. Finally, I wished them both well and ended the call. As I placed my phone face down on the table, Emily reached for my hand. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. A few moments later, Dr. Harris returned with a reassuring smile and told us everything was progressing beautifully. Looking around the softly lit hospital room, I realized that peace was never created by avoiding difficult conversations. Peace was created by protecting the people who trusted you most, even when doing so required disappointing the people you once feared upsetting. Our son arrived just before sunset, healthy, peaceful, and impossibly small. The first sound he made seemed to wash away weeks of tension that had quietly settled over our lives. Emily looked exhausted, yet her smile carried a kind of happiness I had never witnessed before. When the nurse carefully placed him in her arms, every worry that had filled the hospital room disappeared. Olivia arrived an hour later holding a handmade welcome card covered with colorful hearts and uneven block letters. She stood beside the hospital bed with wide eyes before gently touching her little brother's tiny hand. Then she whispered, "I am going to take care of him forever." Emily laughed softly through happy tears, and I realized this was the family I had always wanted our children to remember. Not perfect, not loud, simply safe. Later that evening, after Olivia had gone home with my sister to get some sleep, I stepped into the quiet hallway to stretch my legs. My phone showed several missed calls and a long chain of messages from different relatives. Some simply congratulated us. Others politely asked why my parents had not been invited to meet the baby. Before I could respond, Aunt Linda called again. She told me the entire family had already heard what happened. Apparently, my father had spent the afternoon explaining that Emily and I were deliberately keeping everyone away from the baby without any reason. Aunt Linda calmly replied that people had also heard about the restaurant incident, and for the first time many relatives were beginning to question a version of family history they had accepted for decades. She quietly admitted that several cousins had contacted her privately saying they had experienced similar situations over the years, but never wanted to create conflict. Listening to her, I understood something remarkable. Patterns remain invisible until someone finally refuses to participate in them. Once one person speaks honestly, others often discover they were never alone. Before hanging up, Aunt Linda said she was proud of the way I had handled everything. She told me that protecting my wife without humiliating my parents showed a kind of strength our family had been missing for a very long time. When I returned to Emily's room, I found her asleep with our son resting peacefully. Beside her, the evening light filtered gently through the hospital window, filling the room with a calm glow that made everything seem still. I sat quietly beside them, realizing that love was often expressed through ordinary moments no one else would ever notice. Adjusting a blanket, holding a hand, remaining present without needing recognition. The following morning, the nurse informed us that only approved visitors would be allowed into the maternity unit. We thanked her and decided to keep the room private for one more day. There was no anger behind that decision. We simply wanted time together before returning to everyday life. During breakfast, my mother sent a short message that read, "We hope you will let us know when you are ready." It was the first message I had received that contained no expectations, no instructions, and no assumptions. I stared at those words for several minutes before showing them to Emily. She smiled gently and said perhaps everyone needed a little time to understand that respect grows best when it is freely given instead of quietly expected. Looking down at my sleeping son, I silently promised him something I wished someone had promised me years earlier. He would never have to wonder whether protecting the people he loved would disappoint someone else. In our home, kindness would never require silence, and respect would never depend on who held the most authority at the table. 1 year later, our dining room looked very different, although most people would have noticed only the new high chair standing beside the table. I noticed something else. Every chair had been placed with quiet intention before anyone arrived. Emily's seat was the first one I pulled out. She smiled as she sat down, balancing our little son, Noah, on her lap, while Olivia proudly helped arrange birthday cupcakes across the table. Sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the room with the familiar warmth that had become the heartbeat of our home. There were no unspoken rules about who mattered most. There was no silent competition for comfort or attention. Everyone who entered our house was welcomed with the same respect. Aunt Linda arrived carrying a homemade apple pie, followed by my sister and her family. Laughter filled every corner of the room as the children chased balloons across the living room. Emily looked around the table with the relaxed smile I had not seen during family gatherings for many years. For the first time since I had known her, she did not seem to be wondering whether she needed to earn her place. She simply belonged. My parents were not there. That decision had not been made out of anger. During the months after Noah was born, we had exchanged several conversations, a handful of letters, and a few carefully planned phone calls. My mother gradually began asking questions instead of making assumptions. She listened more than she spoke. My father, however, struggled with the idea that authority could exist without control. Every discussion eventually returned to what he believed children owed their parents. I finally understood that respect could never grow while someone insisted on collecting it like a debt. We never argued. We simply accepted that healing could not be rushed. A few days before Noah's birthday, an envelope arrived in our mailbox. Inside was a handwritten note from my mother. She congratulated Noah on his first year of life and thanked Emily for taking such wonderful care of her grandchildren. At the bottom of the page, she had written one sentence that stayed with me long after I folded the letter. "I am learning that being included is a gift, not a guarantee." There was no excuse for the past, but there was something different. There was humility. I handed the letter to Emily, and after reading it, she quietly placed it inside the family photo album instead of throwing it away. She said that real change often begins with small moments people choose not to overlook. Later that afternoon, Olivia asked if she could make a toast before everyone enjoyed dessert. She stood on a small step stool, holding a paper cup filled with lemonade in both hands. Looking around the table, she smiled with complete confidence and said, "I like our family because everyone gets a seat." The room became wonderfully quiet. Aunt Linda wiped away a tear. Emily reached for my hand beneath the table. I looked at our daughter, our son, and the people gathered around us, realizing that children often understand life's greatest lessons in the simplest words. They remember how people make one another feel long after they forget the details of any single day. As the evening came to an end and the last guests headed home, I remained in the dining room for a few extra minutes. 9 chairs surrounded the table. None of them seemed more important than another. I gently pushed each one back into place before turning off the lights. A year earlier, one chair had revealed everything that was broken inside my family. Tonight, every chair reminded me of everything we had chosen to rebuild. In the end, the greatest inheritance I could ever leave my children would never be a house, a savings account, or a collection of family traditions. It would be the certainty that in this home, every person would always be treated with dignity, every voice would always be heard, and the people we loved would never have to question whether they deserved a place at our table.